Last week, I said that we were going to talk about something regarding objections to a statement that I made. What we've been talking about is the omnipresence of God. And last week, we talked about that God has no spatial limits. That is, he's not bound to any, boundaries. He can't be confined into a building. He's not confined into a room. He's not confined into a geographical area. God is everywhere. He has no spatial limits. And as a result, God is in every space, or you could say place. That is not the same as the false teaching of pantheism. This is not pantheism. Pantheism differs in that pantheism says that everything is God because God is in everything. Therefore, that leaf on the tree is divine, and that evil spider with 8 legs that is straight from the pits of hell is also divine. And I stand by that statement regarding spiders. I will stand by my claim that it wasn't a serpent in the garden, it was a spider. We just mistranslated it as serpent. That's my argument. Why? Because I hate spiders. And I'm going to stick with it. Okay, all kidding aside. Pantheism says everything is divine because God's in everything. But that's not what omnipresence means. It means that there is no place that God isn't. Because of that, because God has no spatial limits, and because he is in all places, I said that God is in heaven. Heaven is a place where God exists. It's where God dwells. God is on earth. Well, we know he physically walked the earth. God the Son physically walked the earth. But God, triune Godhead, is on earth. There's no place that God isn't. But I also said that God is in hell. And I said there are objections to that one, and I would cover those objections. Well, last week I said I would do it the following week. Well, this is now the following week. So we're going to be looking at some of the objections to the statement that God is in hell. The first objection is this, that there are some passages that talk about being separated from God. And I'm not going to read these passages. I'm just going to talk about them and mention what they are. And they are on the sheets there. Matthew 25, verse 41, sinners are told to, quote, depart from God. Isaiah 59, verse 2 says that sin causes, quote, a separation between people and God. In Proverbs 15, verse 29, it says that God is far from the wicked. In Habakkuk 1:13, it says that God cannot even look on sin, least of all be in its presence. So therefore, this must mean that to be in hell is to be separated from God, to be apart from God, because God cannot be in hell, because that would mean that these verses cannot be true. However, some responses or problems with this objection that these passages talk about being separated from God, ergo God cannot be in hell. First, that fails to consider the context of these verses. I've said it many times, context is important. And when you look at the context here, when it talks about being apart from God or separated from God, it's talking about being separated from his goodness, his grace, his mercy, his blessings, not from God himself in his totality. And so we have to keep that context in mind. Also, it creates a situation where God's wrath is fully separate from God himself. To say that we can be separated from God and yet still be under the wrath of God in hell means that the wrath of God and God himself have to be distinct from each other, separated. Now, I've written down here this. One can be hidden from God, but not hidden from God's wrath. That's the claim. However, God himself is inseparable from his attributes, and thus if one could escape God, one could also escape God's wrath. You see, it goes like, think about it this way. If God's wrath and God himself are two distinct, lack of a better term, things, okay? Although God's not a thing, he's a person, but for simplicity, two separate things, and that his wrath and himself can be apart from each other, that means a person can escape God himself. because they can be apart from God. However, his attributes and his person are inseparable. They cannot be separated. Where his attributes are, he is. So if you can escape God, you can escape his attributes, including his attribute of wrath, without Jesus Christ. However, we know that's not true. Now, I have an illustration here. Water. Water has various attributes or characteristics. One of the characteristics is it has weight. You can measure how much the water weighs. Water in its liquid form is malleable. It can take different shapes. In this case, it's taking the shape of a cup. If we put it in a bowl, it'll take the shape of the bowl. And so water is malleable. Another attribute of water is it's wet. Water is wet. It's one of the attributes. I want to focus on the wetness. Wetness and water. Water is the object. Wetness is the attribute. Now can I make this sponge wet and yet have no water on it? This sponge, at least the part that I put in the cup, is wet. In order for the sponge to be wet, can it be wet without any water? Can I separate the two? No, there is water in this sponge. That's what makes it wet. You cannot separate the wetness of the water from the water itself any more than you can separate any one of God's attributes from God himself. Where God's attributes go, God himself also is. And if you can separate the two, you run into another problem. That is, you've created spatial limits on God. And you've said God is omnipresent, except. God is everywhere, except. God has no limits, except. But there are no limits. As we've seen in various scriptures from last week, God has no spatial limits. Third, to say that you can be separated from God, and some people say because God can't even be in the presence of sin, if we hold that God can't even be in the presence of sin, that raises another theological problem. How's anybody saved? In order for salvation to occur, God must be in the presence of sin. Another thing to think about is in order for God to save people, sin had to be placed upon Christ, which means God had to not only be in the presence of that sin, God the Son was in the presence of that sin because it was credited to him, plus God himself had to see the sin. If God can't look at the sin, if he can't look upon it, how's he going to deal with it? He can't, because he's separate from it. There's no hope. However, he did. But also, there is one alternative to how sin could be placed upon Jesus and yet God not be in the presence of sin. And the only way for that to happen is if for somehow at some point Jesus either gave up his deity or never was fully God in the first place. The problem there is that is a heresy known as canonicism. And canonicism is a heresy that teaches that that Jesus himself, in totality or in certain times, was not fully divine. But that is an unbiblical doctrine. And anybody who teaches that Jesus was not fully divine at 100% of his existence, which meaning from eternity past to eternity future, if anybody ever denies the deity of Christ, they are denying the Christ of Scripture, and they are not Christians. By the way, there is a preacher, very popular, very famous, who does and has repeatedly advocated and taught canonicism. Bill Johnson at Bethel Church in Redding, California. He has at numerous times said that Jesus was not divine. He was a mere man. That is a heresy that was actually addressed many centuries ago and rejected, rightfully so, because in Scripture we see that Jesus is always fully divine. But Bill Johnson advocates that it's not, and there are other preachers who have advocated for Bill Johnson, lifted him up as a good, solid biblical teacher, which he's not even a Christian because he denies the biblical Jesus. He creates a Jesus who is not in Scripture and creates a Jesus of his own ideas. And this isn't the only problem with Bill Johnson, but there are other preachers who've lifted him up, who have endorsed him, supported him. And when someone says, oh, look at that heretic is a good, solid teacher, I have to question the one who's endorsing him and say, are you discerning the truth? Do you know the truth? Are you even Christian? Because how can you advocate someone who has blatantly taught a heresy? But that is the other option, for Jesus to take sin upon himself and yet God not be in the presence of sin, whereas Jesus is not God, but we know that's not true. Sin had to be in the presence of God. So those are just some of the responses or problems to the objection that there are some passages that talk about being separated from God. Now, objection number 2 is, put simply, God is not in hell. I like to rephrase it this way. If someone says God's in hell, they're saying basically, no, he's not. Well, there are some responses to that objection, which is really less of an objection and more of a I don't buy it. Well, I don't believe it. First, like the first objection, to say God is not present in hell is to say that God has spatial limits. Now, this is not a perfect illustration because it's a circle, and circles have, by definition, limits. But imagine, for the sake of illustrative purposes, imagine that depicts, well, infinity. All space of all time, everywhere, through infinity. But I can't draw infinity, I don't have a board big enough. By saying God is not in hell, what you're saying is, okay, first we have heaven. Heaven is, for simplicity, God's home, okay? Earth. God created earth, and of course, in earth, I would include all of the rest of creation, all of the other planets, all the stars, and so forth. Okay, creation. That's where man lives. God created that, and God dwells also on the earth because he has no limits. Hell. God created hell. For what purpose? That is the place where wrath lives. I should say God's wrath. Hell was created for Satan and all of those who follow him by rejecting God to live forever in eternity under the wrath of God. And by saying God can't be in hell, what you're saying is God, again, let's imagine this is infinity, God has no limits except here. God is everywhere present except there. And what that does is it says God has limits. God is not everywhere in that case. God is not omnipresent. And in Scripture, we've seen already from last week, and if you weren't here last week, it will eventually be on the podcast. Last week, we looked at various passages that showed us that God has 0 limits. And if God has 0 limits, you can't say, well, except. No limits. Also, Scripture actually tells us, outright tells us, God is in hell. Let me read to you Revelation chapter 14, verses 9 through 11. It says here, now this is John writing what he has seen and what he's being told by God, by Jesus. And another angel, a third, followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and its image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured in full strength into the cup of his anger, and he will be tormented with fire and sulfur, check this out, in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, these worshipers of the beast and its image and whoever receives the mark of its name. This is a description of hell. This is hell. And this is a place, what's going on here? It actually tells us what hell is. It is a place that will drink God's wrath, the wine of God's wrath. So it was a place of God's wrath, verse 10. And it is not just merely wrath. Now, God will pour out wrath on earth at times. He has done that. Noah's flood is an example of wrath. However, the wrath that he's poured out on earth was not pure, unadulterated wrath with nothing else. There was always some sort of grace to it. Noah's flood is the best example of extreme wrath because the entire globe was judged and flooded. Yet, Noah and his family were saved. There was still grace in this. And furthermore, it didn't totally annihilate the world so that it could never be restored. It was restored after the flood. Also, it was not permanent. The waters subsided. So it was temporary. Here, we have the wrath poured out, it says in verse 10, in full strength into the cup of his anger. And how do we know further that it's hell? Because Jesus had already described hell in various places, talking about the fire that never ends. Well, here we have, what do we have? The person who worships the beast, this is talking about those ultimately who reject Jesus, who deny Jesus. This person will be tormented with fire and sulfur. So this is hell. And then we can skip a little bit. How long does it last? The smoke of the torment goes up forever and ever. No rest. It is eternal. This is a place of unadulterated, pure wrath of God. And God is pouring out that wrath. God is pouring it out himself on these people. Why? Because they have sinned against him. Now, that may seem unfair to many people. Why would God pour out this kind of torment for this long, for eternity, on someone just simply because they simply didn't believe in him? That's not fair. Well, actually, it's very fair. I've said this before. God said at the very beginning, you sin, you die. Hell was created for Satan and all those who follow him. Who are those who follow Satan? Not just those who are Satanists. Anybody who denies Jesus, anybody who denies who Jesus is, who rejects Christ, is following Satan. There is no middle ground. And so hell is a place for Satan and all those who follow him. Now, let's go back a little bit in this passage in Revelation. In verse 10, hell here, this torment, this wrath is being poured out, says here, in the presence of the angels and in the presence of the Lamb. The Lamb is Christ, the Son of God, God the Son. It doesn't say in earshot or in the knowledge where Jesus just knows that it's going on. No, in the presence, which means Jesus is there. What is he doing there? Pouring out wrath. One of the issues, and I didn't have it on here, but because it's kind of a subset, kind of an underlying view of, well, God's simply not in hell, is the idea that, and I've heard people say this, God can't be in hell because he's not being punished. And I agree. God's not being punished in hell. He is the Punisher. Not any connections with the Punisher of Marvel Comics. Totally different thing. Now, the difference between heaven, earth, and hell. We have three, lack of a better term, realms. And we're going to go all the way back to Genesis 1. I'm not going to be reading out of it because I'm going back to that time in Genesis 1, before the fall of man. Before the fall of man, there was heaven, there was earth, and there was hell. All three already existed. Heaven, perfect in every way. Perfect love, grace, mercy, goodness. All can be summed up with one word, holiness. Hell is also wrath, but it is perfect wrath. Why? Because it is God's wrath and everything of God is perfect. It is perfect wrath being poured out. The thing is, on earth, before the fall, earth shared those basic characteristics. The difference is Adam sinned, and when Adam sinned, earth and creation became tainted by sin. And earth was no longer perfect. But if you jump forward a few books to Revelation, it talks about the new heaven and new earth. What it's talking about there is the restoration of that back on earth to a pre-fall status, where the earth that will exist will be like it was before the fall. The only difference is at that point, when the new heaven and new earth are established, there won't be anybody sinning against God, because sin, death, and all of that will at that point be there, under the perfect wrath of God. And by the way, his wrath is not just perfect, it's also holy and righteous, because God must hold sin accountable. If he lets sin go, he's not a just God. He must judge sin. It must go to hell. So this is the place of God's wrath. And so God is not down there being tormented and suffering. No. God is down there pouring out wrath. Now, here's why evangelism is so important. Every single one of us, apart from Christ, are on the highway to hell, to that eternal wrath. But God said, I give my Son so that when you leave this earth, you don't go to hell. You go to heaven because of Jesus Christ. And the only way for that to happen is through Jesus, which means they must hear it. They must know about it. We must be telling them about it. Because otherwise, that's where we're already headed, apart from Christ. And we should not want anyone to go to here. Think about it this way. If we have an opportunity to share the gospel with someone, and we say in our minds, I love God, and I follow his commandment of loving others, but we have the opportunity to share the gospel with someone, and we decline to take that opportunity, what we are saying is, it's okay if you go to hell. How loving is that? It's not. We must take that opportunity. Those are some of the responses to the objection that simply that God's not present in hell. Now, the third objection I've written down here is that God's wrath is in hell, but God himself is not. Of course, then I would say, see back on the separation of God's attribute from himself. Can't separate the two, which is one of the objections that actually it's the second objection I have written there, that God cannot be separated from his attributes. This does separate him from his attributes, and it says that God's wrath is not where God is. The first one there is whenever the Bible talks about God being somewhere, it's not talking about just part of God. It's talking about the person of God, the whole person. And so when it talks about God being in this place or this other place, the person of God, and where the person of God goes, his attributes also go. Now, I do have some resources down here, and I'll just kind of mention those. 3 sources there. The first one is from Michael Horton, who wrote an article on the Gospel Coalition website, where it titled, Hell is Not Separation from God. And you can check this out, and you can read it yourself, and you can look at it. Another one is from John Piper on his Desiring God ministry website. He answers the question. This is actually from him being asked the question, him answering it verbally, and then they just simply transcribed it. The question that was asked is God everywhere and absent from hell? So the idea of, can God be omnipresent and yet not places? And he answers that question. The third one is from Got Questions Ministries, and their article is, what does it mean that hell is eternal separation from God? And they answer that question. But I wanted to point out these sources to say, here's some other sources you can go to that you can learn more about the relationship between God's omnipresence and hell. Now, with that being said, I do want to stop there, and we'll pick up next week looking at the idea of God expressing different attributes at different times.